And with that, we're going to actually kick off our conversation for today. Before we welcome in our panelists and have them introduce themselves, we wanted to start off this conversation at a common ground of how we can all come together to this conversation from our different backgrounds, but understand the narrative and the mission of what we're trying to do. So we ask everyone to take a few seconds to ask yourself, a few 30 seconds to ask yourself 3 different questions. The first question is going to be, how many Black debaters or coaches do you know? And if you've never been in debate, you can ask yourself, how many Black people do I see in policymaking areas, such as governors, legislatures? How many do I know of? The second question is, how many Black female debaters or coaches do I know of? How many Black female governors do I know of? How many Black female legislatures do I know of? And the last question we want you to ask yourself is, how many Black LGBTQ debaters have I met? Do I know of? How many Black LGBTQ people are governors or in legislative policymaking spaces? Please take 20 seconds to just create a list yourself and internally reflect. Thank you so much for doing that exercise with us. And with that, we just wanted to make sure we started off the conversation there, because that within itself really explains why this conversation is needed. If you found yourself struggling to create a list, that means that there must be anti-Blackness in that space. And that's why we're having this conversation, to acknowledge how anti-Blackness appears in different spaces, but also to get key takeaways of how we can all be better allies and making sure these spaces are more welcoming for Black bodies. So with that, I want to talk about the agenda for today. We're going to be acknowledging anti-Blackness, like I said, in debate, but it can translate into any space. And then we're going to be talking about in what forms does it manifest. We can talk about anti-Blackness as a broad concept, but really digging in and talking about how it manifests allows us to go to the third agenda point, which is, after we acknowledge how that happens and how it manifests, what are key takeaways that we can do to address those anti-Blackness avenues and how we can be better allies. So I would love to now introduce our lovely panelists, all of whom, not all of whom actually, some of whom I've not been able to meet before, but I'm so excited. I've heard exciting things about them, and I'm so excited that they're here today and that you can speak with them as well. And with that, I'm gonna first allow Anthony to introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. I've been in debate for the last 20 years. I would say when I debated, it was around 1997 to 2000, where I was in Lincoln Douglas debate, often the only person of color in the elimination rounds at national circuit tournaments, having to fight even just to be heard on issues of race, class, etc. After that, I went to Stanford University. I was an at-risk student. I'm alumni of the Breakthrough Collaborative, so I had no money. Then I was super first generation. And at Stanford, I started coaching debate teams in Northern California, primarily students of color, and I have some stories from that. Then went to Yale to do a PhD in political science. After that, I worked for a financial research company doing a lot of diversity, inclusion, and learning and development work. So I've been in the corporate space, and in that job saw a lot of anti-Blackness. And then, quit that job because of that. And now I work as a managing director for Victory Briefs, and I run my own admissions company called Ivy League Hacker. So my goal is to kind of spread democracy and education for all people, and frankly, hack our anti-Black systems so that people have an opportunity, no matter who they are, what they look like, what their gender, etc. is.
Thank you so much, Anthony. We're so—
I also coach Isidore Newman in LD, so.
Yes, he does. Thank you so much, Anthony. We're so glad you're able to join us. And then we're gonna have Nyla introduce herself.
Hey everyone, I'm Nyla. I'm a rising sophomore at Brown University. I went to school at Sequoia, which is in Georgia, and continued to compete like at Afton College. That's like mostly my continued involvement. In the high school community, I mostly just work at summer debate camps. Last summer, I worked at Emory and like coached at NDF, and this summer I'm coaching at NDF again.
Thank you so much, Nyla. We're so glad that you're able to join us. And then we're going to have Courtney introduce herself.
Hey everyone, clearly still getting the hang of Zoom. My name is Courtney Brunson. I went to high school at St. Thomas Aquinas High School in South Florida, which is very close to Nova. It was a very competitive district, so I had the opportunity of getting to know Cornelia and her partner and a lot of different debaters. I also did public forum for all 4 years of high school. I had the opportunity to debate issues with, such as affirmative action and reparations with a lot of white people. So I think that was a really great, informative, and terrible experience. So really great that all these years later we have an opportunity to talk about that and how we can make some changes. I had the opportunity to go to Mount Holyoke College and, similar to Nyla, compete in ABDA college parliamentary debate, and that came with some costs and benefits as well. I also had the opportunity to go to both at NDF and Champion Brief, so I've had the opportunity to see kind of how some camps handle some issues around diversity and inclusion. After graduating, I went to Capitol Hill to work for Elizabeth Warren. I was a staff assistant. I was a legislative correspondent on housing and other economic policy issues, and I was an investigator for the Oversight and Investigations Camp. So that was all due to much of the things that I was able to learn in debate, including my research. So that's something that was really important for me to do. I recently left last year to go to Harvard Law, and I just finished my first year at Harvard Law, and I'm interested in doing public interest law work in the future. So thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Courtney. We're so glad that you were able to join us. Yes, Courtney's been one of the people I've been looking up to for years. I'm so glad she's here. And then lastly, we have Bradley to introduce himself.
Hi, y'all. I'm Bradley. I went to All Saints Episcopal for about 2 years, my junior, senior year, which is in East Texas. Now I'm a rising sophomore at Yale, probably studying somewhere English, maybe sociocultural anthropology. That was largely impacted by my experience in debate and sort of looking at anti-Blackness and a lot of that. I taught last summer at VBI, and I'll be teaching this summer as well. Looking to probably go to like constitutional law somewhere in that area. But yeah, I'm glad to be here. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Bradley. And that's all of our panelists, our lovely panelists for today. And now we're just going to jump into our conversation. But before we ask the first question, we really wanted everyone to know that this is more of an informational space. And while we will have an opportunity for you guys to ask questions at the end, we really wanted this to be a more listening exercise where you can just hear from Black coaches and debaters themselves how anti-Blackness occurs from their experiences and how we can just all do better. And this is why we intentionally made everyone's videos and audio off if you're not a panelist or me, just so that we can really just pay attention and listen to what they have to say. And with that, we're going to go into our first question, which is for all our panelists. Anyone can answer this. What does anti-Blackness mean?
I can go ahead and start that conversation. So the general understanding of the word anti-Blackness is tied back to slavery. Like, in the broader sense, it's used to describe the continuing like dismantling of humanity of the Black community and the violence that perpetuates simply for being Black. And it's like, it's used instead of the term racism, because racism can involve like the whole like Black people are criminals, like that entire idea, but it also is used to describe like Asian students are viewed as model students and should be good at science and math, etc. So anti-Blackness is used like to specify like the impact of racism on the Black community rather than like any broader sense.
Definitely. Thank you, Nyla, for starting off. I think that's a great way to define it. It's definitely distinguishing it from racism. It's very honing on Black lives and how they're impacted. Does anyone else want to add to that, what anti-Blackness is? Yes, Courtney.
I would say, especially in this context, I think anti-Blackness is particularly a better framing for our thinking than racism, because I think particularly in areas like debate, it's all of those nuanced experiences, right? So there are so many things I'm sure all of us experience where someone would, say something, or we would experience something and we couldn't quite put our finger on why it made us uncomfortable, or we couldn't quite put our finger on why our interaction with someone was different than their interaction with another person. So I think that it really embodies all of our experiences, all of the situations that we had to confront, all of the circumstances that we had to overcome, because they aren't as explicit, they aren't as in your face, or when they are explicit and they are in your face, they're supported by institutions that allow for it and allow for it to continue. So I think this is a really great framing. So just like, I'm going to continue to give my hat to Cornelia and all of the other organizers, just because I think this really gives us a ability to speak about those experiences that are more difficult to talk about, because it's easy to call someone out for being a racist, but it's much more difficult to call a lot of people out for the things that they did to either commit such actions against certain debaters or certain institutions, and support the people who actually did those types of things as well. So thank you.
I think that's a great way to put it, Courtney. Like, definitely that's what we wanted first to start off this conversation, defining what anti-Blackness is, so that we can all have a common definition of what it is before we go into more nuanced, more specific examples from our panelists of how anti-Blackness manifests. And with that, that's a great transition into our next question, which is, in what forms does anti-Blackness manifest in debate? And I know there can be a lot of examples on your mind, but we just want to really provide our audience some examples so that they can kind of understand what and how and in what ways it manifests. Anyone is welcome to start.
Yeah, I guess I'll start. I guess what I can add to this is just a couple of perspectives. One perspective is as a coach, the way that anti-Blackness can show up is whether or not other coaches have respect for you. These could be Hall of Fame coaches sometimes. Will say, you're not a real coach because you look a certain way, or you're beating us because we're the good guys, right? And I've seen that quite a bit. And that's definitely something for organizations to really think about, which is how are coaches of color treated, and how are their accomplishments taken into consideration. Second way that I've dealt with, which is anti-Blackness against Black teachers. So how are our bodies interpreted? Like, if we are being disciplinarians or acting with authority, is that seen as intimidating or scary? And sometimes, and I think this speaks to Courtney's point, because people may have good intentions, but maybe enacting lots of violence onto Black teachers who are in debate because of the way they interpret our bodies and the way they interpret our performances, not just as debaters, but as people who are imparting knowledge.
I think that's great. Thank you so much, Anthony. I think Bradley, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, sort of adding to Anthony's first point, I definitely think that anti-Blackness exists a lot within, like, especially within public forum, how generally people rank teams and individual speakers on like how good they are and like reputation and things like that. I definitely think within this sort of good debater syndrome that exists largely within PF these days, that's especially prevalent. Because there a lot of times, I think, and to some extent I think this is also sort of stratified by like class, which can sort of also be intercorrelated as well. I think a lot of times we generally sort of rank sort of, quite honestly, like white males generally are usually at the top of the list. It sort of goes down sort of from there. And a lot of times this can also be, I think, reaffirmed by a lot of judging as well. Quite honestly, in terms of like who do judges believe commands a room, or who do they think is taking charge, or things like that. That I think largely affects our perception of like who's good or who's bad.
I can definitely add to Bradley's point on that. As a Black female debater with a white male partner for my senior year, there were numerous rounds where we would both like just be debating normally, and in general, my partner was slightly more aggressive than I was. But the number of rounds that a judge would look at me and be like, you were far too aggressive, you should not have interrupted your partner, you should have, or not my partner, you should not have interrupted your opponent, etc., in a way where it's like, I personally didn't think that I was doing more than my partner being more aggressive or doing anything else, but my presence was interpreted as being more aggressive than my partner's, despite us doing similar, if not like me being less aggressive. But the second way to me that anti-Blackness has manifested is just in how like the positions that Black people have in the debate community. And by that, I mean like the positions of authority that Black people do not have within our community. Look at any of the like big debate camps, look at any of the best schools, best debaters. There are very few Black people who have those positions, that have the position of captain, that have the position of like running a camp, positions of being members of working of those camps. And it's problematic because it kind of gives off the sense that Black people aren't as good or are not capable of being good in the community, which encourages people to stop being in the community because they feel as though they can't reach that level of like goodness as a Black person.
Thank you so much, Nyla, for that. Would anyone else like to add to that?
This is just exceptionally gratifying just because I think everyone has been saying a lot of what I've experienced. And I really appreciate Anthony going on multiple levels because I think that's exactly right. As a female debater myself, it was specifically existing at the intersection of being a woman and a Black woman, because it would also be not only all of my ballots, like I could make some paper mache sculpture from all of the ballots that I got about me being too aggressive, me being too loud, me being too demanding. But there was also, you know, times about, you know, I had to wear, you know, certain outfits. And my coach was very careful about making sure that we wore the suits with the button ups and all of that stuff. And the amount of times that I had people questioning whether or not I was dressed professionally enough. Right. So there was also an undercurrent of sexualization, right, that I think happened just across women, but particularly for women of color. And those are the type of experiences I had to think about. I remember my partner for the majority of the time was white. So that was kind of something that we always had to balance when we're like, oh, okay, so like you're going to be more aggressive in front of this judge, you know, catering to your judge, right, and understanding those circumstances. But I think once you become a coach, all of that really becomes amplified because you're in a power position in some sense where you're mentoring and you know, being there and instructing other people. But then you're like, wait, I'm the only one in the room. So if I have some type of issue, am I the person that always has to speak up, or do I have someone else speak up? If there's some type of issue with a camper, just as Anthony said, am I the disciplinarian, or do I have someone else, you know, step in? If there's, you know, something that you wanted to contribute, do you say, I want to contribute to this because I was a debater who had an impressive record, or am I saying, I want to contribute this as the Black woman in the room, right? There's so much back and forth that you always have to go between. And at least for me in particular, that was always a balancing act, because I wanted to make sure that I was authentic to myself and my experiences, and that I did for others what was not done for me, merely because there weren't people who were older than me that were in these places. But at the same time, I wanted to make sure that I was able to be a resource for everyone, because that was what I was getting paid to do, right? So I think there are so many different levels to this, both as a debater and as a coach. And I couldn't even imagine what it was as a teacher, because when Anthony mentioned teachers, it was like, one of the questions you didn't ask, but something I was thinking of, how many Black teachers did I see in debate? And I think there's maybe one, and I met a lot of people. So I think just thinking about what we are doing when we're in the space, but also how we are creating the pipeline to make sure that more are coming in behind us with more resources and more support than we were given on the front end.
I think that's a great way to put it. I couldn't have put it better myself, Courtney. I definitely agree with that. And I just even wanted to add to this conversation that networking, especially in debate, is really important, and people take it very seriously, you know, like getting prep from other teams or just networking in general, meeting new people. I think another way it manifests is my partner was also a non-Black male, and whenever people would try to like talk to us or just like get to know us, they would go to Rafi first, and they would not come to me, even though I'm there with Rafi because we're always together. And I always was questioning why that was the case. Like, why did they have to go to Rafi first and not me? And then also, I wanted to just talk about how I had a coach who also told me and Rafi that Rafi is great for you because he balances you out. And I asked him, what does that mean? And he says, because he balances you out, you're more sassy than Rafi. So he's a good balance for you. And that whole stereotype of a Black woman being sassy, of a Black woman being hostile, that's definitely a major way in which anti-Blackness manifests within debate. And that's why we specifically wanted this panel conversation to be more women than men, because we really do believe that women, Black women specifically, their voices are not really heard. So thank you for that, Courtney. Would anyone else like to add more to this conversation? If not, we can, yes, Bradley.
Oh yeah, I think another, and I completely agree with everything that's been said, especially with the whole partner thing. Because my partner was Asian, and I definitely experienced a lot of that. Of even like people referring to like us as a team as like by my partner's name or things like that, is definitely one of those like smaller things that you only really you notice. You can't really sort of talk about that. But I think one sort of last element, and I think this is something that's becoming more common today, I think specifically within public forum, I think progressive argumentation that has to do with like anti-Blackness and Afro-pessimism has been something that's received like quite a lot of flack over the last couple of years. I think particularly because they've been invalidated as like not being like substance or those types of arguments. And I think that's one thing that I noticed, because I was much more of like a progressive debater, especially my senior year, in talking about like Afro-Pess and anti-Blackness as like arguments, not as just sort of experiences. And I think largely public forum has sort of done a really bad job in terms of being able to treat them not as just as treating them as arguments as within themselves, but also sort of being able to talk about like experiences and sort of narratives behind that as well. And that's something that I think a lot of other forums do quite a lot better. So I think that's just sort of another, I think, element to the discussion, sort of talking about Black arguments as well.
I couldn't agree more. Courtney, you would want to add to that?
Yeah, I didn't even think about topics, and that is like all of the things that I think particularly stay with me many years later, because as many of you, there's countless experiences and you just kind of have to like push those forward. But I remember the topics particularly just because I know that there were times, for example, when I'd have to argue something like gentrification, or I'd have to judge something about gentrification. And there would be, at least when I was a debater, these cards about, you know, the impacts and, you know, the numbers behind it, if it was beneficial, for example. And I would just I would have my legal pad in front of me. I'm like, how do I weigh displacement? Like, how do I explain erasure of culture, right? And at least from a debater's perspective, that was really when I almost saw a schism between, the reason why I love public forum is because it was about what was happening in the real world. But I knew the minute that I walked into that room, I couldn't explain why someone who's been living in their neighborhood all their life, not being able to live there, not being able to get their hair done there, not being able to get their, other stuff there was a problem, because they had a card about how gentrification increased the economic development of a place by, 30% or something like that. And that was something that was really tough for me. And then as a judge, having, to coach people on that end and really having to figure out a way to ask people to protect themselves and not put themselves in a situation where they'd have to, argue against their humanity, for example, but at the same time trying to make debaters competitive. So I really went back and forth between, the typical like, having a tough skin and really being able to think about a lot of these topics objectively, but at the same time, putting yourself in a position where you can be most authentic to yourself. And one of the topics I mentioned at the top of the hour was being the only Black coach at a camp when we were talking about reparations. Like, having to have countless, at least having the Black debaters explain to me, like, how do I talk about this? And everyone else coming like, hey, Courtney, like, as a Black person, how do you feel about this argument? Like, how do you feel about like Black people kind of already got benefits, so they don't need reparations? Like, how do you feel about hearing that, right? So it was almost as if I was used as this kind of like prototypical Black person for them to bounce their ideas off of to see whether or not it was offensive. So I think Bradley is absolutely right, and I thank him for uplifting that piece of the conversation, because I think it was only with our senior year that we started pushing back against the topics committee about things. There was a topic about sensitive religious issues that came after them, trying to get us to debate whether or not there should be a mosque near where the World Trade Center used to be. And we were just like, no, sway, like, we're not going to debate that. That's just simply not going to happen. And, I think that was one of those examples where we showed that the power of the debaters and the power of the community could really alter some of those types of behaviors. But I really think it was just, a drop in the ocean. And we can do a lot more about making sure that if we're going to debate these topics, we have the resources and the ability to do it the right way, but also make sure that we're not alienating people for whom these topics aren't just a topic, it's their lives, right?
Exactly. Yes, Nyla.
I can absolutely relate to everything that she just said, considering that my junior year, I partnered with my brother, a Black male. And the number of times that we got a topic and it's like, oh my God, like the impact of, let's say, health on African Americans and like the impact of that would be like, it's so big. Like we can see in the reality of the community that we are a part of that X, Y, or Z impacts us, right? But then we'd sit down and look at the argument and try and find evidence to support it. And it's like, oh, well, there is only one resource that says that Black people are impacted more by this. We can't even run the argument. Or we would find something and it's like, oh, wow, like this is something that I truly do believe, that I actually think is important and that I can see as a reality. But I don't know if I can handle having someone go up there and say that it doesn't matter. Or having someone go up there and say like, oh, well, like only 15,000 Black people are going to be impacted versus 50,000 people who are going to be saved, therefore it doesn't matter. And like having to choose for myself, like, do I want to run this argument when I know that it will be outweighed, despite the fact that it actually does have more of an impact on real people.
Exactly. No, that's a great point, Nyla. Thank you so much for that. Bradley, you wanted to add something as well.
Yes, and I think that was definitely something that I dealt with, especially coming in, trying to figure out like how to run these types of arguments. And I know we said we talk about like sort of solutions later. But this is something that I was actually pushing a lot during study halls. I think we should be teaching more of framework debate in PF and talking less about impacts and more about like how we should be framing the debate as a whole. Because that's how I figured out, I think generally it becomes more strategic just in terms of the debate to make those types of arguments, but also it sort of allows you to like sort of center it even more on that side of the debate and being more true to yourself. Because I think when you frame the debate about like why these people are and their experiences are more important than sort of general sort of util impacts or other types of things, I think it can make it a lot easier to get around that. And I know we could talk about that a little bit more in terms of solutions, but I just wanted to throw that in there. But yeah.
No, that's great, Bradley. I think that also is a great reminder that this conversation is not just about debate, even though all our panelists have a background in debate. What Bradley was saying was very true. Like even in policymaking, how we frame things is really important. We talk about impacts and how they impact people, but also how we frame conversations and the accessibility of that is also really important. Anthony?
All right, I would say to add on to this, know that you have friends in other events. Policy debaters, student Congress debaters, or whatever the term is, particularly LD debaters, we've been fighting these fights for 15 to 20 years. And there are just several strategies. One is just ridicule. To reflect back what they just said and just sometimes put it in a different population and say, hey, wait a minute. If it was this group, would you dare say that? Right? That's one strategy. And second, don't be afraid to ask for evidence and ask other people of color from other events how to answer something foolish like, only 1,500 people, who cares? Because it's whole national championships that have been lost from folks saying such foolishness. So borrow your resources where they are, and they're not just in public forum, they're in all the other events where people have fought these fights. Bring your weapons, use their weapons with you, and you'll save yourself a lot of time.
Great point, Anthony. That's actually how me and Anthony met at a camp. We were working together, and actually I was the only Black public forum instructor there. But at the camp, there were so many Black people who were in LD that I got to meet. And if I were to go back, that's one thing that I wish I want to tell other debaters as well who are in the fields right now, that public forum, even though it might not look that like it's accepting, while we work on that, there's definitely other people we can look to give us guidance and support, because this is a fight we can't fight on our alone, and we need other people to support us. So thank you.
Oh yeah, we have evidence. We have cards. We have the things that you may think you don't have answers to have already been, that work's been done for 25 years. So you use everything at your disposal.
Thank you, Anthony. Definitely. Courtney?
The one caveat I would make, because I think Anthony's absolutely correct, and I think this is maybe between debate. My team also had a really big speech component and an interp component. Do not let what you don't see in this event push you out of this event if this is the event that you want to be in. Because I know, for example, Nova is just one of the things that I was thinking about, where there was a Nicholas Gilliard. Like, there were so many talented Black DIers, or dramatic interpretation performers, who were so good at what they did and who were so talented. But I also just remember people being like, wow, you're really dramatic, why don't you try DI? Because it seems like people are a lot more comfortable having, you know, the drama and the intrigue, because that's what they were used to seeing Black people be in. So it was a lot more comfortable many times for people to associate me as being an interpreter because I was loud and enthusiastic and extroverted, than to ever think that I would be a serious public forum debater. So my one caveat to what Anthony said, because I completely agree, is that you will use the resources from any event for the event that you want to be in, not the event that you think you should be in.
Excellent point, Courtney. That's so spot on. And that's also for all the coaches who might be watching this. That's another way of how anti-Blackness manifests. If you tell your debaters or your students who are Black that you encourage them to go into speech, or you disencourage them from going into debate events, that's a form of anti-Blackness. You're telling them that they're not serious enough, or they're not going to excel in the debate of avenues. Thank you for mentioning that, Courtney. And before we go on to our third question, I also wanted to make mention to all of our attendees that you can submit questions for afterwards. When we have questions from the audience, you can submit that to Rafi's email address, and his name is the email address. So it's just rafi.khan@emory.edu, and we'll make sure to answer those questions. Thank you. And now going on to our third question, we wanted to ask our panel specifically, what does good allyship look like? How can I be a good ally? If I'm non-Black, especially right now, I have a duty to be an ally. How can I fulfill that duty? And I know it's a loaded question, so if you need a few seconds to think about it, definitely anyone can start the conversation.
I won't answer it as a whole because I think I mean, there are classes taught on the allyship and stuff like that. But at least in my own personal, I think, debate career, I think one thing that my partner did particularly well that I really appreciated was that a lot of times when sort of small, sort of like incendiary things, like those sort of smaller parts of anti-Blackness sort of showed up that he noticed, he would call it out oftentimes. And so that sort of, I think the process of calling out sort of racism, anti-Blackness is, I think, a burden that a lot of people have, and becomes oftentimes very, very heavy, I think, the longer you decide to debate. And so I think one thing that good allyship looks like is sort of when you see something that sort of looks like what you think it may be in terms of like being anti-Black or racist, sort of calling it out and sort of addressing it and making sure that, you know, your Black friend or your Black partner doesn't have to do it every single time. Because a lot of times I think that create sort of a burden that oftentimes I think pushes people out of debate because they just don't want to deal with it anymore. So I think that's definitely one element.
Exactly, definitely. Anthony?
Yeah, a couple of things I'll say. I'll try to be specific. The first thing is ask for permission. So there's some examples here where people assume, oh, you're Black and the camp topic is on affirmative action. You're the token who needs to be the reference point. Just asking, is this a topic you want to discuss? Would go a really long way, because sometimes you don't want to hear it. In the corporate space, right? I've been 2 weeks of hell because hearing phone calls from folks who are said, oh, I want to check in on you. And then there's no asking for permission, as if you want to have that conversation or you want to be a part of a diversity inclusion panel, right? So that's one. I think the second thing, and this has impacted me directly, is just if there's a Black debater or a debater of color or a debater of any minority status who you think does really good work, tell them, because they're so often told the opposite. And one way of doing that, and I try to do this through victory briefs, and we do a lot of it, is just explicitly hiring those folks. Including in situations where their achievements and their abilities and their teaching may not be seen. Like in the olden days of LD, for example, I mean, I would have never been hired because although I was top 20, got a lot of bids, whatever, people said, oh, you're just not a good debater. You're not one of the ones we know. And I had non-Black people actually tell me, hey, we want you to teach for us. Otherwise, I wouldn't be in the activity. So I think a conscious, deliberate decision to force yourself to see the achievements of folks who are doing really well in activity that's hard for minorities to do well in.
I agree, definitely. And hitting on Anthony's point about permission, I definitely think that as coaches and debaters, not assuming that because someone is of a Black identity that they are willing and open to speak about a conversation about the Black community, definitely you need to ask them before you have that conversation, because you don't know their experience that is related to it, and you don't know what anyone's background or what traumas or triggers they might have. So please make sure that you ask permission. And with that, if Black identifying debaters or coaches or anyone you know who is Black does give you how they're feeling or does answer that question, you should not dismiss their voices. And that's the biggest thing. If you ask for how they're feeling, or if they tell you, even if you don't ask, your first reaction, if it's defensive, then that is a form of anti-Blackness. So make sure when debaters are saying their feelings that you don't disown it, because it's not a scope argument, because it doesn't impact as many people as you thought it would, because it's just a one individual case. That's anti-Blackness, and it's going against and disowning Black voices. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation. Does anyone else want to add more to this question of how can I be a good ally? Yes, Courtney.
I think this is very specific because I think you three did an excellent job of covering a lot of what I was thinking. But another thing is just do your research. Like the amount of times I was so sick, because so many, I want to acknowledge that there has been progress. When I went to debate camp, there was no diversity day, diversity shut. That did not happen. So this was a new thing that has happened in recent years. So I want to express that I am grateful for that. On the other hand, if you need to figure out a diversity activity, don't ask me. Use Google, use someone who is a professional. And just like you said, Cornelia, because there's a difference between actually doing your research and making sure you know what works for what you are looking for and getting someone's opinion on something, right? If you want Courtney Brunson's opinion on something, I am more than happy to ask you. If you are looking for the Black community's opinion on something, I am not your resource, and I'm not going to answer your questions unless you pay me as if I am the whole conglomerate of Black people in this country. So I think that dynamic is really important, because I think you guys really explain well some of the larger things that you can do, but this is a really easy thing. Just do your homework, don't be lazy, and ask your own lead backstaffer.
Excellent, Courtney. You have me at a loss for words. That's a great point. Thank you so much for adding to that. Also, I just want to add to this conversation that disowning voices is one thing as well, but for specifically Black women, if you feel like Black women are too sassy or too aggressive, even if you might not say that, but you might be thinking it yourself, please internally reflect that is also a form of anti-Blackness. So if a Black woman, like for example, recently, I reached out to a camp just to talk about spreading the message of this panel and what we're doing, very sincerely asking if they can help support and reach to other debaters. And I was told that I was hostile, that I was bullying. And if you know me, I really take that very seriously. I really try bullying for me is a very serious topic, and I would never want to bully anyone or make anyone feel hostile. So recognize that even if you might have not been doing that on purpose, that's a form of anti-Blackness, and that's a form of, that's not okay. So I just really wanted to put that out there to be completely transparent, that this is still happening in debate communities, even though we've progressed with camps. Debaters, specifically Black women, specifically Black men as well, specifically Black LGBTQ debaters are experiencing this right now. So before we move, yes, Courtney, please.
if I can just, because I think what you said is something that's really important. And I think all of you mentioned just calling it out and being the person that's in a position to say something about it. I am personally putting this out to not just, you know, the coaches, but I'm also putting this out to the alumni. That is bullshit. What you just said you experienced is bullshit. And because I am a grown ass woman, I can say it's bullshit. So if you want to, you know, personally message me which camp said that, which person said that, I am in a position to call it bullshit, because I think there's so many people who, especially people of color and Black people, who are disillusioned, and as soon as they're done, they want to like clean their hands of it. And I get that. But allies, your work is, if you hear something like that, if you hear someone saying it like that, maybe if you're a debater, you should absolutely be calling it out. But if you are an adult, you sure as hell should be calling that out, regardless of where you are, regardless of the position you're in. And that, I just wanted to say, is a good example of just people who have a little bit more equity and have a little bit more power to really put their money where their mouth is.
Thank you, Courtney. Anthony, and then Bradley.
Yeah, I want to add to that. I will not name any names here, but I've been in many situations where adults, either fellow coaches or TAP staff, will let those kinds of things happen to students or to other coaches. And that's where in certain, some activities, things go straight to heck. We have to be much, kind of like the police need to start being accountable to their own. Adults in our various activities can't just say, I'm just going to let the kids fight it out, or I'm just going to let this person be mistreated. If that happens, then we've failed our job entirely. So my challenge to all the other adults, the TAP staff, the coaches, camp directors, is to make sure that they're doing their part, because it doesn't matter to scream Black Lives Matter if when those lives are in threat, you don't say anything and you don't punish people, you don't fire people, you don't ban people from judging rooms.
Thank you so much for that. You took it out of my mouth. Thank you, Bradley.
And I think definitely sort of adding on to that, I think another element is that a lot of times you don't know how far as this is for somebody. I think a lot of times, like even an adult, like you don't know how many times students have experienced something like this, and you don't know how far somebody is to quitting an event or just stopping debating altogether because of things like this. So I definitely think you need to treat each situation as if it is that moment. Because you don't know. It happens in so many different ways that I feel that are invisible. That you can't just treat something as small and something as big. I think you definitely need to sort of keep that same energy with everything as around sort of the debate sort of experience. And then just adding another sort of element of allyship, just sort of another thing. I think also when it comes to like people that you're friends with and partners and things like that, I think also lifting up the accomplishments of your Black debaters that are friends or partners, whatever it is, I think is also really another element. I think a lot of times it goes unnoticed and unseen, and it really can like make a difference. Like personally, like I know my partner, he did that for me a lot. Like he even did that on the national stage, and honestly, it warmed my heart. And it really makes all the difference. And so doing that, I think it's just smaller things that you can functionally do to sort of just make sure your partner feels as though like their accomplishments have been recognized, those types of things.
Definitely, exactly. And I also want to put it out there, if a debater or any person comes to you with a proposition of how to make their community better, like I was trying to reach out to the camp saying, I, as a Black person, am trying to get you to support Black lives, recognize that I don't have to be doing that and it's not my responsibility. So the fact that I am doing it, all I ask is that you try to, even if you don't agree with what we're trying to do here, it's not really political. It's really just trying to uplift Black lives. But even if you don't want to uplift Black lives, we can have a conversation about it. So to dismiss me is, as a Black person trying to uplift Black people, just recognize that whole optics of that as well. Would anyone else like to add to the question of what good allyship looks like? I think we hit a lot of great points. Anthony?
Yeah, very, very fast. The term in the corporate world is sponsorship. This is talked a lot about in terms of gender, but I think it applies to all different marginal groups. So as part of everyone doing the research, don't ask your Black friend how to do this. Go Google sponsorship. There's plenty of literature on this that's very easy to access, and it'll be easier that if you are asking people of color to join an alliance with them, you're putting less emotional labor on them because you're properly Googling. So sponsorship is a term you should be talking about if you're trying to find ideas, because there's a lot of people asking for ideas, but not a lot of people actually, doing their reading.
Exactly. It's not our responsibility. Just want to put that out there. And lastly, it would be a disservice to not acknowledge the Black debaters, the Black coaches, the Black people who are within the debate community within this conversation. We really want to acknowledge them as well. So our next question is, for all of our panelists, what advice would you give to Black debaters, Black coaches, Black speech, anyone who's Black in our community? What advice would you give them during this time? And I know a lot of you hit upon the point of they might be in the event alone. So just keeping that in mind, how can we encourage them to just be themselves, to independently be themselves? Nyla?
So for starters, stay in the community. Like, that's just the first thing. There aren't that many of us there, but if you are in the community and then you leave, that is one less person who is there to uplift the rest of the community. You have to try and stick it through. I went to school in Georgia. My school was about 80% white. My debate community had a total of 3 Black people in the 5 years I was there. I can count on 2 hands the number of Black debaters I hit in my entire time in my district. By the time I graduated, like my sophomore year, I was novice, junior year varsity, and senior year overall captain. It is possible to move up in the ranks, even in this type of system, but you have to stay in the community. You have to continue to be there to uplift Black voices and other Black people, and to come into the positions of authority for you to be able to help people in the future. But if you leave the community, that's not going to happen, and it will stay the way that it is.
Great point. Thank you. Bradley?
I have I guess 2 things. I think one, I definitely agree with what Nyla is saying. I do think also there's sort of another side of the coin as well, though, is that if at a certain point you feel as though debate is no longer serving you, and that the community is becoming toxic to the point that it's sort of hurting you as a person, I do think you should probably leave. I think there's a difference to some extent, and it's a hard to find line between sort of leaving because it doesn't serve you versus sort of lacking that competitive success that may also because you're Black. And I think there's sort of a line there. But definitely, I mean, I think both sides definitely sort of difficult to find the line. But I think one thing that worked for me particularly was I think finding somebody, a role model that you could look up to, whether it be in your event or another event, is something that I used a lot. For example, I looked up to 2 people. It was Cornelia and Devon Murphy. They sort of just provided the light for me. And there are people that I was like, all right, these are successful Black debaters and people that I can see tangibly and people that I know worked just as hard and that they achieved it. And so I think finding somebody that you can look up to can sort of help to make sure that you know that this can be done, that it's not like you're fighting against something that nobody else has achieved before. But then also, I think just reaching out to them as well. I had conversations with Devon at VBI, and that really, really helped me quite a lot in my experience. And so I think that's, a really good actionable for Black debaters.
Great point. And also, if you're not in debate anymore, if you're a coach or you're outside of the debate community, if you're an alum and you're Black, definitely reach out to Black debaters. It does mean a lot to hear you and to hear what you've gone through so that they can use that advice as they're debating. And Anthony?
A couple of things other than my get evidence from other people, fight fire with fire thing. These are more psychological. I think the first thing that's helped me is this: don't internalize other people's problems. Mm-hmm. So when people say you're scary or you're sassy or whatever, they always say in therapy, that is a reflection of the criticizer, not the criticized. You should pity those people. You should not try to understand, rationalize, explain, justify, or avoid that stuff, because your body has a right to exist in a space. And the only reason people behave that way is because they are actually scared and threatening. And let's be honest, Black debaters do really well in debate when they're given equal opportunity. That is threatening the systems of privilege and power and folks who think that only white people or men can do well. So recognize your power in that regard. And I think the second thing is free to hold a boundary. Like, you don't have to take criticism silently. If someone says something that you just they don't think makes any sense, you can ask questions like, why would you say that? What do you mean? Like, put on your cross-examination crossfire hats and make the other person explain what they're thinking, or force them to, or are you just willing to say, I'm not going to take that feedback because that doesn't feel like it's about my performance. You have the power to respond. You don't have the responsibility to take that on yourself.
Definitely. Nyla, you wanted to add to that?
I was just going to say that to add on to what he was saying is, like he said, you don't have to take it on to yourself. Like, you don't have to be the sole person that is dealing with the problems, especially, like, I can say that as both a Black person and a female. Whenever coaches, whenever opponents, whenever judges have said or done certain things, I'm lucky enough to have had the ability to reach out to my coach to talk about things if something bad happened. But also, like, there was a circumstance where I felt like my school was disenfranchised, like, at a certain tournament. So I reached out to NSDA because I'm like, this is a serious issue that I feel like I can't handle by myself. And just knowing that even if you aren't comfortable sending an email to NSDA, message one of your friends, a coach, another Black person, and like set up a pathway so that if something bad happens, you have someone who is in some position of authority that can help resolve that problem. Don't just sit with it and like let it fester, because that is the reason why it becomes toxic, is because there isn't that conversation. So just try and find ways to start that conversation so that if something happens, you have someone to reach out to.
Great point, Nyla. And I think that also is relevant to our third question about how to be a good ally. To be a good ally means being an ally in every circumstance and not at your own convenience. So being an ally, you will get pushback, but recognize that Black people get pushback all the time. So that you getting that pushback is just you having that obligation and that duty and that commitment that you're going to be a good ally in all spaces. So thank you for that, Nyla. Courtney?
Yeah, I think this is a continuation of the third question, because Nyla made me think about it. If I didn't make it even more explicit, another way that we need allies is for you to put your money where your mouth is. If the NSDA is talking about having diversity, then have a diverse board. If your coach is talking about needing diverse students, then have diverse coaches. If you want diversity in debate, then put the money where your mouth is to make sure that there is diversity in debate at the toppest levels and at every level. Because I think it is easy for you to say to Black debaters and everyone else in this field, find those resources. But if those resources aren't there, it won't matter in the first place, right? Because I think, for example, I'm thinking off the top of my head of different Black coming across them, but there was also at some level, at least for me, and this is something I had to get over, a level of competitiveness, because I'm like, wow, what really makes me special is that I'm the only like Black female debater in PF, right? And I am disappointed in myself for doing that, because it meant for years, rather than trying to find someone who understood what I was going through and that type of solidarity, I was competing against them. There's so few of us. And I think that was something that I did as a disservice, because there simply wasn't enough resources to give me an opportunity to say, hey, there's actually 2 or 3 of us in here, and we can actually have something going, and we can actually be supportive of each other, rather than people in situations whispering something different in my ear. So I think we need the resources there in the first place in order for us to tell Black debaters to actually refer to them. And I think there are so many coaches throughout my career that made that easy for me, but it certainly wasn't something that, it took all of the things that we talked about. It took the networking, it took the grinding, it took going to those late out rounds. That wasn't something that was just handed to me. That was because I worked hard, and only then did I have like all of those resources in front of me, right? So that was just something that I really wanted to reiterate, because I think it would be, incredibly disingenuous for us to say, stay in there and fight the good fight if we don't give them the resources to fight the good fight in the first place.
Great point, Courtney. Spot on. And with that, we're just checking the time. It is 5:01, so if you do need to leave, you can do so, but we really don't want to rush this conversation. We really want to make sure that we address 2 more questions that we think are really important that our panelists to discuss. So if you don't mind, panelists, staying with us for a few extra minutes so that we can answer those questions, that'd be great. Thank you so much. So the next question is about the current wave within public forum of definitely encouraging more women to be in public forum and in debate spaces. And the question was, how do we allow those two movements of incorporating women's voices, but also incorporating Black voices within debate space, especially for people at the intersection, Black women? How can those two movements work together?
I guess I'll start. I was doing my dissertation on intersectionality. So the first place I would say is read that literature, and read that scholarship. Not just only if you're a Black woman or if you're Black or female. Like, I think it's kind of argument that everyone should pay attention to, because the first step is to understand what that intersection means and why those conflicts happen. Otherwise, in some events, you can just get embarrassed talking about feminism if you don't understand that there are women of color who've added a lot to it, right? Similar things, same things in economics and what have you. So I would say read that literature.
Definitely. Anyone else? Yes. Courtney?
So Bradley said this, and I wanted to give him his credit, but I want to say it again. Call it out, right? Because I think there are so many opportunities. I am lucky, for example, I am dating someone that I met in high school debate, right? And most of my close friends years from now are people that I met in high school debate. And I think there are so many ways that those relationships are longstanding, but one of them was because they called the shit out when they saw them. I can't overstate how much that means. And I think, as I said at the beginning of this call, it's really hard sometimes, right? Sometimes it's coded. Sometimes it's, me being questioned if I belong with the rest of my team because I'm the only Black one there. It means, if the hotel receptionist refuses to be nice to me when all of the other people were, able to answer or get any of their questions answered easily, right? It really just means calling it out consistently, because I think particularly for a Black woman, or I will even speak for myself personally, it is much easier for me to just put on a straight face and put on a strong face and pretend it didn't happen and keep it moving. But that weighs heavily on me, and I've talked to other people about how it weighs on them as well. So I think this is particularly one of those areas where you have to call it out. It's great if you're a friend that calls it out, because I think it means long-lasting relationships in the future. I think it's even better if you are a coach, if you're a teacher, to call it out, because I think this is particularly one of those areas where we are losing so many great female debaters. And I also think it's just, an opportunity to, as some other people said, uplift them, because there's too many times where I got, a speaking award and people would be like, oh, well, it's just because she's a Black woman. Or if I got into a late outrun, they're like, oh, well, they just needed a woman and a person of color there, right? So being that voice in someone's ear, that anytime they are being successful, saying how great they are and say how deserving they are, rather than them being some type of byproduct of this fake affirmative action, because we know sure as hell that the NSDA doesn't have that stuff in place, or maybe there would be some certain outcomes. So to make her be that ear, or be that person whispering in their ear to say, you're doing great, you deserve this, and make sure that they know that every single, path they take.
Amazing. Thank you for that. Anthony, did you want to add anything to that?
No, that was perfect.
Thank you, Courtney, for that. And I think that goes transition to our next question, which is very similar to what Courtney was saying. But how can the NSDA, how can coaches, how can camps, how can debaters, how can anyone within the debate community encourage, which is what Courtney was saying, but also enable more Black debaters, coaches, judges, etc., to feel comfortable and get involved in debate?
So I'll just start off by talking about my experience with the debate camp I worked at last summer. At NDF, I won't go into too much about it, but last summer was the first time that there were 5 Black people working at the camp together. So they had a debate round that had 5 Black people, 4 people debating and 1 person running the round. And that's an amazing improvement on having 1 Black person or 0 Black people for the last however many years, right? But NDF is, I looked at a bunch of different camps. I'm not going to name all of them, but I was like, let me see what the numbers of Black people are, and just I want to compare. every other camp I looked at had 0, 1, or 2 Black people. And I don't know what the opinions of anyone else in this chat are, but I feel like there are more than 0, 1, or 2 good Black debaters that exist on the circuit any given year. So like encouraging, like having camps actually hire Black people to work at them, or having Black people maybe not force them to talk about their experiences, but giving a space where it is possible to have conversations about it, where Black people are either leading the conversation or at least contributing to the conversation about their own experiences, is super important to encourage Black people to stay in the community.
That's a great point, Nyla. Bradley, and then Anthony, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think as to sort of addressing, I think there's sort of the NSDA level. I think largely, and I think this isn't just the NSDA, but I think that a lot of times they use our stories and our voices to try and, show that they're being diverse and sort of use them to try and get more people to come into debate, but not really. So I think maybe an element for the NSDA is like, a lot of times the people who win like Coach of the Year are people who are serving like Black and brown communities. I think maybe if somebody wins Coach of the Year, giving them like a board position or something like that, like giving people who are doing the most with oftentimes the least actual positions in power to actually make change, I think is one thing that NSDA can do a lot better. And I feel as though if they're going to use our voices, they have to actually let us use their voices when we're talking not just for them, but also against them as well. So I think that's just sort of like a top level thing about NSDA.
Great point. Anyone else want to add to that? Yes, Anthony.
So the first one on NSDA, again, my bias is from Lincoln Douglas, but they've done some work in trying to pull people into wording committees and groups and onto, literally as of last year, onto final rounds. The thing I would say though is be careful about cracks missing, right? Because I remember when I was trying to get on the LD panel, some random woman didn't know who I was, and I didn't have any ribbons, and that almost didn't happen, even though people at the top had that intention. So, like, it's the lesson for corporations and any organization and debate teams and the NSDA is, don't assume your current systems work. Don't assume that people are going to go through the pipeline, and then if no one's there, oh, we didn't have a good pipeline. That's foolish, to say the least. So, that. Number two, and I think this is on the debate community as a whole, and each individual student, each individual coach. It's frustrating sometimes as someone who helps run a camp, but we do a lot of work on doing, pay gap analyses and making sure that people of color are paid not just as well, but sometimes at the level of their achievement and beyond. That sometimes debate students don't take that on as credibility. They sometimes want to go to camps where there's frankly much less diversity. No names. So it's also on not just the people at the top, but also people at the middle and people, at the ground level, all to investigate themselves and who do they see as good teachers and who do they see as being smart and intelligent. Because if students don't see Black folks who are winning national tournaments, like the folks on this panel, as credible, it's on them too. It's not just on those at the NSDA. So it's like an intersectional problem. We need people at every level to check themselves and to be open to Black bodies, to female bodies, LGBT bodies, Black female bodies, etc., to be authorities and to challenge their image of who a good debater, good teacher, coach, or judge is.
Courtney? Thank you, Anthony. Great point.
Anthony said it, so I'm really just adding like a little bit on top of it to be a little bit more explicit. The first of which, I would actually flip what Anthony is saying. I would go from assuming that your system is wrong, because I think too many people are doing like, oh, like something like it must be like them or something else because we're doing everything right. No, I want you to assume that you are doing it wrong and analyze in each way, okay, maybe we can do this a little bit better. Maybe there's a reason we only have a couple of, African-American, instructors. Maybe there is a reason why the people coming out of our camps are the people from the richest and most well-resourced schools. Maybe there's a reason why we have certain topics that aren't actually reflecting what we should be arguing with, all of these debaters. So I actually, controversial because I know no camp, no program, and no institution wants to be told that they're wrong. But I think that they're going to make a lot more progress if they assume that they are already in a position where they're not doing things as well as they could be doing it, and look for ways to improve. And the second thing that I'm going to say that's even more explicit, I think Anthony said it, but I want to make it even more specific. Pay me the same thing that you're paying someone who is doing my same job. I don't know if it has changed. I hope that it has, and I will not say any names. But there was too many times that it was from when I was a year out, I was years out, that I would know that I was struck. But because someone had a better record, or that they paid 1.5, twice, 3 times as much as I did for the same job. We are now getting to a point where people are talking about that. We're having conversations now. So I won't say it as a threat, but I will say people know now more than ever who is paying people adequately and who is paying people the same for the same amount of work that they're doing. I know that there's many levels where you're trying to, flesh out some more to get, some high-level TOC champions, NSTA champions, and to some level, I think that might be necessary. But if you're going to want me to be that one diverse person on your staff, then you are going to pay me for the work that I'm doing in the same way that you're paying someone else for the work that they're doing, because that has fallen short multiple times. And I actually think that we've been doing a great job as of late calling that out. But I think that's one of the things that programs and especially camps really need to do moving forward.
Thank you so much for that, Courtney. And that's actually one key takeaway that we wanted to encourage all of our attendees and those who are going to be seeing this recording and anyone else who sees this, that you need to call the organizations that you are part of out. So your teams, you need to reach out to your coaches and say, what are we doing to encourage more Black debaters on our team? It's up to all of us to make sure we hold people accountable. If you're going to a camp this summer, ask them, what have they done differently to encourage more Black people to be in the staff, to come to the camp? So we're really putting that onus on all the attendees here. Please, please hold your organizations, your people accountable. And with that, I just wanted to end with one more question. I really wanted to go to this question because it's a big, major question going on with debate right now in terms of anti-Blackness and how we can navigate that. And that question is, how can non-Black debaters run arguments on issues that affect Black people in a productive way that doesn't become harmful from Black debaters to have to debate against? And that's a question from our audience member.
I'll start. This has been a big fight in the Douglas debate, and where I think even sometimes Black debaters debate it poorly. So I think my first call out is for every debater who runs this kind of literature. Please do the literature review. Please cut your own cards. Nothing's more frustrating than that. Even if I see an African American debater reading Afro-pessimism, and I know they're miscarding it, and I know certain authors would have a headache, right? So, but to all debaters, these kind of arguments are not just arguments to deploy like weapons. They're arguments that speak to particular experiences and deserve just as much respect as we would take it in a foreign policy literature or in an economics literature. Because when you're a graduate student someday and you miscut or misread or just don't even know the context of the words that are being said out of your mouth, that gets you in serious trouble. And so I think as debaters, like having that kind of intellectual integrity is really important for all debaters who want to use any literature, but particularly this kind of literature. That's one thing. And I think the second thing, don't be afraid to go back in time, right? So often we think that Afro-pessimism, as an example, is the only literature. You should know critical race theory. You should know what Du Bois said. You should know what Washington said. You should know what MLK said after the I Have a Dream speech. There's no excuse in a world where we have all these resources. And frankly, nationals rounds up and lost because people misquote these kinds of things and that's get annihilated, right? So from a competitive standpoint, we should treat this kind of literature as seriously as any other one, and that means reading the foundational texts, not just because you'll be a good student and a good human being, but because it's also really important competitively, because you'll have a coach like me around, hear about what you're doing, and then we'll go find the books. So it's in your interest. You ought to do it, but it's also in your interest to do it.
Thank you, Anthony. Bradley and then Courtney.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with everything Anthony said, and almost to like a further degree. I don't even think you should spend as much time. I think you should spend more time like studying these arguments than you should other regular arguments, because you're not just incorporating, this isn't just impacts, these are people's livelihoods and their experiences that you're incorporating. So I think it should definitely be dealt with care. I think as to specifically dealing with sort of like non-Black people running these types of arguments, I think there's generally been like a large debate. And I've sort of been on the outside of it within the LD community. But I don't know, personally, and feel free to disagree with anybody on this panel. I'm not a huge fan of people reading arguments, specifically like Afropass arguments or like Black nihilism type of arguments, like on Black debaters specifically. I don't know. It seems just sort of in poor taste to me. I don't know. Anthony, I know you have much more experience than I do, so feel free to push back if you have other thoughts. But I also think that when it comes to like running an argument in debates in which like it's like all like non-Black, I think you generally have a little bit more leeway there. But generally, just sort of, and sort of similar with the Anthony saying, don't use these arguments as tools or as ways to win the debate. I think they should only really be used in cases in which you truly feel passionate about a way in which this topic affects Black people particularly. I don't really think this should be something that you should just be doing on every single topic just because you think it's a way to win. I think it should be done very specifically and done with care. And I think also you should, and definitely ask, but you should be consulting with Black coaches. Feel honestly, if anybody here like wants to ask me any question about it, I mean, I may not be as knowledgeable as the rest of this panel, but feel free to ask me whether this feels in taste or something like that. Because honestly, I think getting second, third, fourth opinions are very, very much necessary when you're running these types of arguments. You can never really be too careful. But yeah.
Really, I agree with you on that. And on the particular question about non-Black debaters running certain arguments, that actually amplifies your second point, which is you should be talking to people who do this work day in, day out, because they disagree. And there's a whole situation where people are yelling at each other online, but no one's reading the literature. And nothing's more frustrating to a Black scholar than that, on both sides of that fence, right? So I would say, do your research, be literate, and also be intellectually careful, because it's not enough to say, this is how I feel, I'm going to yell at everyone. You really ought to be doing your work to read the books and read the literature and read the dummies books you have to, so that you know what the heck you're talking about and you can articulate it clearly. Because that's another problem, is that people use this literature and they don't even know what they're saying, and they can't define the words they're using, which becomes doubly violent, and there's no place for that.
I couldn't agree more. Courtney, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I'm a little bit upset at Anthony because he said some of the things that I was thinking of. Disrespectful, but I think it was exactly right, and it was something. First, a lot of what they are doing makes more sense when they understand the broader understanding, and that's why these camps, these debate programs, you need to make sure that everyone has a meaningful understanding of race. So making sure they have critical race theory as a tool in their toolbox, making sure that they understand income inequality, economic inequality, racial inequality, gender inequality as concepts rather than something that they only think about when it becomes relevant to their topic. They need to have that foundation, and having that foundation makes it a lot easier for them to say, maybe this doesn't make sense, or maybe this isn't phrased the right way. And the second thing is language. And I think this in particular becomes very difficult, and I, as much as every past, present, and future debater, have difficulties with that, because when you're thinking so fast, when you're thinking extemporaneously, and you're trying to write something down, or you're trying to make something, make sense in a speech, you aren't as critical of how you are saying something. But at least particularly as a judge, as a coach, as a debater, hearing someone say, those people, or hearing the Blacks, you know what I mean? Like, it is just such an easy slip up that if you just take a second to think before you say something, it's a lot less likely that you're going to say something hella problematic because you're just speaking too fast. So maybe this is just, I don't know what PF looks like anymore. Maybe people speak too fast and it doesn't really allow for them to have that second, but just taking that second to make sure that you are saying something in a way that you want someone who you are talking about to receive it makes all the difference in making sure you're not saying it too quickly in a way that is hurtful or saying it in a way that is offensive.
Thank you, Courtney. And Nyla.
I can absolutely relate to that last part of it. I was lucky enough to debate the reparations topic when I was in 8th grade. And I just remember one particular round where I was saying that reparations should happen. And one of my opponents was like, okay, well, like, obviously we had the entire debate round. And in their final focus, this girl went up there and said, well, the people who would be getting reparations are old, so they shouldn't get it because they're going to die soon anyways. And it's like, first, that wasn't productive to the argument. That doesn't even matter, though. Just thinking about, like, how you want to run these arguments and making sure that you're doing it in a respectful way to the Black community, and also, like, just in general, like they said, don't run an argument because it's going to win a round. Run an argument because you actually believe in what it's saying. And if you're going to run an argument that you actually believe in, like, just make sure that it is supported in a way that, like, makes sense, I guess. Like, I don't know. Just make sure that, like, if you are going to run an argument like that, even if you are not Black and you're going to run it against Black people, don't make it so that they have to disregard, like, themselves or their own community. Like, there are ways to frame arguments that can be responded to that won't necessarily say, like, as a Black person responding to it, I have to hate my own community or I have to destroy whatever else I believe in. So make sure that if you're running against Black people, you frame it in a way that it is responsive, like you can actually respond to the argument without making them, like, dismantle who they are.
That's a great point, Nyla. I definitely agree with that. That's spot on. And actually, I had the privilege of being a camper for Courtney when she was a counselor during the reparations topic. And she was the only Black counselor. And just optics and how you approach things is very important. I would watch people on the staff go against what Courtney was saying on the reparations topic. I didn't believe I was the only Black woman camper there. So me watching her being attacked by these people, that's also a way of anti-Blackness. If Black people are speaking about themselves, you should not be combating it. You should be listening to them and having a conversation. Bradley, you wanted to add something to that?
Yeah, and I guess I'll just sort of give the advice that Devon gave me when I asked him just sort of generally about, like, how to run these types of arguments in PF. And I think one thing that he told me that I felt was ended up being very true, and I think very important, is that know that be willing and prepared to lose because of the argument you're going to run. I don't think you should be running this argument to win whatsoever. You should be completely fine with losing. Me and my partner lost and outrounded states because we ran, I wouldn't go into it, but a similar type of argument. We're just like, all right, yeah, like we're willing and prepared to lose just because we feel so strongly about it. And I think honestly, I wouldn't recommend running the argument if you're not willing to do that, especially if you're non-Black. Like, I don't think this should be a strategy. You're talking about people's lives. And so the round should no longer, I think, become, like, necessarily just sort of a round. I think to some extent, I think there's sort of a performative education element of talking about this topic in the ways in which it is important, not just to strategy and everything else, but sort of largely what is going on in real life and how does this impact this group of people and things like that. I definitely think that you should sort of forego that element of the debate if you're going to run that type of argument. But yeah.
Thanks so much, Bradley. And that, unfortunately, is the last question we're going to have for this conversation. But to see that it's 5:25 right now just points to how important this conversation is. And I don't know about anyone else, but I myself even learned more of how I can do better. And I really hope that other people did as well. So I really want to thank our panelists, all four of you. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and having this conversation with us. Also, we want to recognize that this is only part of the conversation. There are so many other questions that we couldn't get to today, and that just puts the onus on all of us that the conversation needs to continue. And we really urge and encourage every attendee, pick at least one thing that you learned today and share it with someone. It could be one small thing, but that conversation can lead to other things. So we really encourage you to maybe just pick one thing and share it with someone else. And with that, we also wanted to highlight that we're still accepting donations for the Know Your Rights Camp, which is a Black Lives group. We have more information on that on our Instagram account, or you can reach out to us as well. We really want to raise these funds for Black youth. And lastly, we just want to remind you guys that everything we spoke about today is recorded, and we are also compiling a document of all the things that we talked about so that you guys don't just stop this conversation here, but you can use it as a resource at your camps in your schools, wherever. The NSDA will also be having access to this. So we're just going to have that out there publicly. So if you want to learn more and remind yourself about all the things we talked about, we will be having that for you. And with that, I just want to say one more last thank you to all of our panelists for having this conversation. Thank you to the attendees for staying this long, and we really, really appreciate you all. Thank you so much, and have a good day. Bye, everyone.